Sometimes the heart finds what it needs in the most impossible places. High in the Colorado Rockies, where the wind carries secrets through ancient pines, Eleanor Whitmore sat by her frosted window, watching the first snow of winter blanket her world in silence. 3 years had passed since the accident that stole her music, her mobility, and her faith in tomorrow. Her fingers, once nimble enough to coax magic from piano keys, now struggled to hold a teacup without trembling. She'd accepted her fate as a ghost haunting her own life until the storm brought him to her door. Thomas stood there like something carved from legend itself, snow melting from his dark hair, eyes holding the weight of mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet strength of someone who'd walked through fire and chosen kindness anyway. "Ma'am," he said simply, "looks like we're both seeking shelter tonight." What Eleanor couldn't know was that Thomas had been seeking something far more precious than shelter for the past 45 years. And what he couldn't know was that saving her broken heart might finally heal his restless soul. But when love transcends the impossible, can two people find forever in borrowed time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor stared at the stranger through the crack in her cabin door, her damaged fingers gripping the wooden frame until splinters bit into her palms. The wind howled behind him like a living thing, driving snow horizontally across the narrow porch where her father once sat whittling in summer evenings that felt like another lifetime. "I don't take in strangers," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, she hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, not since Mrs. Henderson from the valley had trudged up with her monthly delivery of provisions and pitying glances. Thomas didn't move closer, didn't push. He simply stood there, patient as the mountains themselves, snow accumulating on his broad shoulders. Up close, Eleanor could see the lines around his eyes, not from age, but from squinting into countless storms, countless sunrises over peaks that touched the sky. His coat was well made but worn, the kind that spoke of years spent outdoors, and his boots were the heavy leather sort that could carry a man through anything these mountains might throw at him. "I understand," he said quietly. "But this storm's going to last 3 days, maybe 4. I've got nowhere else to go, and I suspect neither do you." The observation stung because it was true. Eleanor had nowhere to go, nowhere she belonged anymore. The concert halls of Denver and Chicago were as distant as the moon now. Her elegant apartment in the city had been sold to pay medical bills. Even the neighbors who occasionally checked on her did so out of duty, not affection. She was a burden everyone tolerated, nothing more. Another gust of wind sent snow swirling between them, and Eleanor caught something in his scent: pine and wood smoke, leather and something else. Something clean and wild, like air that had never known the touch of civilization. "How do I know you won't?" She stopped, realizing how foolish she sounded. What could this stranger possibly want from her? She had nothing worth taking, nothing worth anything. "Because I've been where you are," Thomas said. And something in his voice made her look directly into his eyes for the first time. They were grey like storm clouds, but deeper, older, that place where every day feels like punishment for still breathing. Eleanor's throat tightened. She thought of the loaded pistol in her father's desk drawer, of the nights she'd sat staring at it, weighing the weight of tomorrow against the weight of continuing. How could this stranger know? Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that shook the cabin's timbers. Eleanor had lived in these mountains long enough to know that thunder during a snowstorm meant nature was truly unleashing its fury. They were in for something terrible. "There's not much," she said finally, stepping back from the door. I can't cook like I used to. My hands—" "I can manage," Thomas said, stomping snow from his boots before entering. "I'm grateful for whatever you can spare." As he moved into her small sanctuary, Eleanor became acutely aware of how she must look. Her dark hair hung loose and unkempt past her shoulders. Her dress, once a respectable grey wool, now bore the stains of someone who lived alone and had stopped caring about appearances. She leaned heavily on her walking stick, her withered legs barely supporting her slight frame. But Thomas didn't stare. He didn't flinch or offer false sympathy. He simply removed his coat with economical movements and hung it on the peg by the door as if he'd done it 100 times before. "Fire's getting low," he observed, moving toward the stone hearth that dominated one wall of the main room. "May I?" Eleanor nodded, sinking into the worn armchair that had become her throne and her prison. She watched him work, noting how his hands moved with practiced confidence as he built up the flames. The firelight danced across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. "What's your name?" she asked, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. "Thomas," he said without looking up from the fire. "Thomas Brennan." "Eleanor." The word felt strange on her lips. She'd almost forgotten she had a name beyond that poor crippled woman in the mountains. When Thomas turned back to her, the renewed firelight caught something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. As if he saw something in her that she'd forgotten existed. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows, rattling the glass in its frames. The storm was settling in for a siege, transforming her small cabin into an island in a sea of white fury. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor wasn't facing the darkness alone. She had no idea that she'd just invited something impossible across her threshold, or that the next few days would force her to choose between the familiar pain of isolation and the terrifying prospect of being truly seen. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither quite knew how to cross. Eleanor found herself studying Thomas as he settled into the chair across from her father's chair, though she didn't have the heart to tell him. No one had sat there since the funeral 3 years ago, when the few mourners had gathered in this very room to speak in hushed tones about Samuel Whitmore's dedication to his damaged daughter. "You hungry?" she asked, the words scraping past her throat like sandpaper. It had been so long since she'd played hostess that the basic courtesy felt foreign. "When did you last eat?" Thomas countered, his grey eyes taking in the sharp angles of her face, the way her dress hung loose on her diminished frame. Eleanor couldn't remember. Yesterday, the day before. Time had a way of blurring together when each day held nothing but the careful management of pain and the slow passage of hours. "I don't eat much anymore," she said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Food required effort, opening cans with her ruined hands, standing long enough to prepare even the simplest meal. Most days, she survived on whatever required the least movement, the least reminder of what she'd lost. Thomas rose without another word and moved toward her small kitchen. Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist she could manage, but the truth was she'd grown tired of managing, tired of the daily battle just to exist. She listened to him moving about her space, opening cupboards, assessing her meager supplies. The soft sounds of domestic activity filled the cabin in a way that made her chest tight with something she couldn't name. When was the last time someone had simply done something for her? Not out of obligation or Christian duty, but because they chose to. "Tell me about this place," Thomas called from the kitchen, and Eleanor heard the strike of a match, the hiss of the old stove coming to life. "It was my father's retreat," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "He built it after my mother died, said he needed somewhere the world couldn't reach him." She paused, remembering those early years when she'd visited during summers, back when her hands could coax magic from piano keys and her legs could carry her up mountain trails. "I suppose I understand that now. And before, you lived somewhere else?" Eleanor closed her eyes, letting herself remember for just a moment. "Denver, Chicago, sometimes. I traveled for—" She stopped. The word concerts felt like a stone in her throat. What was the point of explaining what she'd been when what she was now was so apparent? "For music," Thomas said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Her eyes snapped open. "How did you—" "Your hands," he said, reappearing in the doorway. "Even damaged, they move like a pianist's. And there's sheet music on that table, though it looks like it hasn't been touched in some time." Eleanor followed his gaze to the scattered pages of Mozart's Sonata No. 11. pieces she'd once performed for audiences of hundreds. Now the notes looked like cruel hieroglyphs, mocking reminders of a language she'd lost the ability to speak. I played, she admitted, before the accident. Thomas didn't ask what happened, didn't probe the wound that still bled fresh every morning when she woke, and remembered, again, what she'd lost. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to whatever simple meal he was preparing. The smell of warming food began to fill the cabin, something with beans and preserved meat, humble but nourishing. Eleanor realized she was actually hungry, truly hungry, for the first time in weeks, as if his presence had awakened something in her that had been sleeping. "The neighbors," she said suddenly, needing to fill the comfortable quiet before it made her feel too much. "They'll worry if they see smoke from an extra fire. Mrs. Henderson comes by once a month with supplies. She'll be due again after the storm passes." "What do you tell them about how you're managing?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That I'm fine. That I don't need anything. That I prefer the solitude." She flexed her damaged fingers, watching the way they moved like broken birds. "They want to believe it. It's easier than admitting they've left a cripple alone in the mountains." "Is that what you are?" Thomas asked from the kitchen. "A cripple?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "What else would you call it?" "Surviving," he said simply, "though I'm not sure that's the same as living." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, angry and hot. How dare he? How dare this stranger walk into her carefully constructed isolation and speak truths she'd spent 3 years avoiding? She'd built her prison from necessity, from the simple fact that the world had no place for broken things like her. But as the warmth from the fire and the promise of a shared meal began to seep into her bones, Eleanor felt something stir that she'd thought was dead forever, something that whispered of possibility, of connection, of the terrifying prospect that maybe, just maybe, she was more than the sum of her damages. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them together in this small island of light and warmth, where anything might be possible. The crash came without warning, a sound like the world splitting open. Eleanor jolted upright in her chair, her damaged hands instinctively gripping the armrests as the cabin shuddered around them. From the kitchen came the sharp clatter of something hitting the floor, followed by Thomas's muttered curse. "What was that?" she gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Tree came down, big one by the sound of it. He moved to the front window, peering out into the white fury beyond. "Can't see much, but—" He stopped, his shoulders tensing. "But what? Part of your roof's gone." Eleanor struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her walking stick as she made her way to the window. Through the driving snow, she could just make out the jagged outline where a massive pine had crashed through the cabin's northeast corner, directly over what had been her father's study. "Oh, God," she whispered. The study held everything, her father's papers, his books, the deed to the property, and hidden in the desk drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, the small inheritance he'd left her. Without those documents, without proof of ownership, she'd have nothing. Be nothing. "I have to—" Thomas caught her arm as she started toward the interior door. "No, that section's not safe. The whole roof could come down." "You don't understand," Eleanor said, desperation making her voice sharp. "Everything's in there. Everything that proves this place is mine, that I have a right to exist anywhere at all." She tried to pull away from his gentle grip, but her weakened legs betrayed her, sending her stumbling against the wall. For a moment, Thomas studied her face in the flickering firelight. Then, without a word, he moved toward the damaged section of the cabin. "What are you doing?" Eleanor called after him. "What needs doing?" he said simply. She watched in growing alarm as he approached the study door, testing the frame with careful pressure. The wood groaned ominously, and she could see snow already beginning to pile through the gaping hole in the roof. "Thomas, please. It's too dangerous." He turned back to her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. There was a sadness there, ancient and deep, but also a determination that seemed to come from someplace beyond ordinary human resolve. "Eleanor," he said quietly. "What would you save if you could save anything from that room?" The question pierced her more deeply than she expected. The deed, she stammered, and my father's music box. It was my mother's. She hadn't thought about the music box in months, but now the memory of its sweet, simple melody threatened to break her completely. "It's on the shelf beside his desk." Thomas nodded and disappeared into the study before she could protest further. Eleanor heard the careful sound of his footsteps, the creak of floorboards under snow-laden beams. Every second stretched like an eternity. What if the ceiling collapsed? What if she lost him too, this unexpected companion who'd reminded her what it felt like to have someone simply care? The realization hit her like another falling tree. She would grieve him. This stranger who'd been in her life for mere hours had somehow become precious to her. When had she stopped being numb? When had she started feeling again? A particularly violent gust of wind sent the damaged roof timbers shrieking, and Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, torn between the urge to flee and the need to stay close to wherever Thomas had gone. Then he emerged, moving with that same calm efficiency, carrying a leather portfolio and a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled with relief. "How did you know?" she whispered as he placed the items in her trembling hands. "How did you know exactly where?" But as she looked up to thank him, the words died in her throat. In the dim light from the main room, she could see snow dusting his shoulders and hair, yet the flakes weren't melting. They sat there like powder on stone, as if his body carried no warmth to dissolve them. "Thomas!" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He was already moving away, toward the kitchen where their forgotten meal waited. "We should eat while it's warm," he said, but he didn't look at her. "And we need to barricade that doorway before more snow gets in." Eleanor stared down at the music box in her hands, its familiar weight both comforting and strange. She lifted the lid, and the tiny melody began to play, her mother's favorite waltz, the one that had inspired Eleanor's first attempts at the piano. But even as the sweet notes filled the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm crept up her spine. The music box was exactly where she remembered it, but she'd never told Thomas which shelf, never mentioned that it sat beside the desk rather than on it. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and Eleanor realized the storm had become the least mysterious thing about this night. Eleanor's fingers traced the delicate mother-of-pearl inlay of the music box, but her eyes remained fixed on Thomas as he moved about the kitchen with unsettling familiarity. The tiny waltz continued its mechanical dance, each note now seeming to mock her with questions she wasn't prepared to ask. "Thomas." She closed the music box with a sharp snap, cutting off the melody mid-phrase. "How did you know where to find this?" He paused in his movements, a can of beans half opened in his hands. "You told me." "Beside the desk," I said, "on the shelf beside his desk. There are 4 shelves there." Eleanor's voice grew steadier as her fear crystallized into something more manageable: suspicion. "This was on the 2nd shelf, behind my father's medical journals, in the dark, in a room you'd never seen before." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind's assault on the damaged cabin. Thomas set down the can with careful precision and turned to face her, but his grey eyes seemed to look through her, rather than at her. "Storm like this, a man notices details," he said finally. "Survival depends on it." It was a reasonable explanation. It should have been enough. But Eleanor had spent 3 years in isolation, 3 years with nothing but her own thoughts for company, and she'd learned to trust the small voice that whispered when something wasn't right. That voice was screaming now. "The snow on your shoulders," she said, clutching the music box tighter. "It's not melting." Thomas glanced down at himself, and for just a moment, something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or resignation. Then he brushed at his shoulders with movements that seemed more theatrical than natural. The snow scattered to the floor in perfect unmelted crystals. "Cold night," he said. "Takes time to warm up." But Eleanor had seen the way those flakes fell. like dust from something that had never been warm at all. Fear crept up her spine with icy fingers. She thought of all the stories her father used to tell about these mountains. Tales of miners who never came home, of travelers found frozen solid with expressions of inexplicable peace. Stories she'd dismissed as the folklore of lonely men with too much whiskey and too little company. "Who are you?" she whispered. Thomas moved closer, and Eleanor noticed for the first time that his footsteps made no sound against the wooden floor. Her breath caught as he settled into the chair across from her, the same chair he'd occupied earlier, except now she could swear she saw the faintest outline of the chair's back through his torso. "I'm someone who understands," he said, and his voice carried the same gentle cadence as before, but underneath it, Eleanor heard something else, something that sounded like wind through empty places. She should run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to put distance between herself and whatever Thomas was. But where could she go? The storm had her trapped as effectively as iron chains, and her damaged legs would never carry her far enough to matter. More than that, though, was the terrible realization that part of her didn't want to run. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone. For the first time since the accident, someone had looked at her without pity, had spoken to her like she was more than a collection of broken parts. If Thomas was something other than human, what did that say about her own humanity that she craved his impossible presence? "Are you?" She couldn't finish the question. Couldn't give voice to the word that hovered between them like a blade waiting to fall. "Does it matter?" Thomas asked, leaning forward slightly. The firelight should have warmed his features, but instead it seemed to pass through him, casting shadows that fell in all the wrong directions. "You've been alone so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to matter to someone. I haven't changed that, Eleanor. I've only reminded you it's possible." Tears burned at her eyes, because he was right. In the few hours since he'd arrived, she'd felt more alive than she had in years he'd cooked for her, saved her precious belongings, spoken her name like it meant something. What kind of desperate creature did it make her that she'd take that gift from anyone, or anything willing to offer it? "What do you want from me?" she asked, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those ancient grey eyes. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to settle into her very bones. "Nothing you're not ready to give," he said. "But Eleanor, when's the last time someone held you, really held you like you mattered?" The question broke something inside her chest. She couldn't remember. Before the accident, perhaps, but even then she'd been too focused on her music, too dedicated to her art to allow for much tenderness. And after, who would want to hold something so damaged? Outside, the storm raged on, trapping them together in this space between the possible and impossible, where Eleanor would have to choose between the safety of her solitude and the terrifying prospect of being cherished by something that might not be entirely real. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, Thomas's question echoing in the silence between them like the ghost of her mother's waltz. "When's the last time someone held you?" The words exposed a hunger she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. The simple, desperate need to be touched with tenderness, rather than clinical necessity. "I don't," she began, then stopped. Her throat felt raw, as if speaking this truth aloud might tear something vital inside her. "I don't remember." It wasn't entirely honest. She remembered Dr. Morrison's impersonal hands examining her crushed fingers after the accident, the way he'd handled her like a broken instrument he was trying to repair. She remembered Mrs. Henderson's brief, pitying embraces, the kind that said poor dear more than beloved soul. But being held, being cherished, that belonged to some other woman's life. Thomas rose from his chair with that soundless grace, and Eleanor's breath caught as he approached. This close, she could see details that shouldn't exist. The way the firelight seemed to bend around him rather than illuminate him, how his clothes bore no wrinkles despite the storm he'd supposedly traveled through. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings, but her body remained still, waiting. "May the 1st, he asked, extending one hand toward her. Eleanor stared at his outstretched palm. It looked solid enough, warm enough, real enough to break her heart. She thought of all the reasons she should refuse: his impossible knowledge of her father's study, the snow that wouldn't melt, the growing certainty that Thomas was something far removed from mortal man. But stronger than fear was the terrible ache of 3 years spent untouched, 3 years of believing herself unworthy of gentle hands. If this was madness, if loneliness had finally fractured her mind completely, then perhaps madness was preferable to the endless grey existence she'd been calling life. Slowly, Eleanor lifted her gnarled hand and placed it in his. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, not the sharp pain she'd grown accustomed to, but something altogether different. Warmth, yes, but also a sense of completion she hadn't felt since before her hands were crushed, before her legs withered, before she became this diminished version of herself. Thomas's fingers closed around hers with infinite care, as if he understood exactly how much pressure her damaged nerves could bear. Then, with movements so gentle they might have been choreographed by angels, he drew her to her feet. Eleanor's legs trembled, whether from weakness or anticipation she couldn't say. For a moment she swayed, certain she would fall, but Thomas's other arm encircled her waist, supporting her without making her feel helpless. When was the last time someone had touched her waist? When was the last time anyone had seen her as something other than a collection of medical problems? "I don't know what you are," she whispered against his chest, surprised to find herself close enough to speak the words into the hollow of his throat. "I don't know if you're real, or if I've finally lost my mind completely." "Does it change how this feels?" Thomas asked, his voice rumbling through his chest in a way that seemed impossible if he truly was what she suspected. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Here, in the circle of his arms, she felt more herself than she had in years. Not the bitter recluse who'd retreated to these mountains, but the woman who'd once coaxed magic from piano keys, who'd once believed in the transformative power of beauty. If this was delusion, it was the most merciful one imaginable. "No," she admitted, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. "It doesn't change anything." The words hung between them like a bridge she was choosing to cross. Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that this moment was a threshold. Behind her lay the safety of her isolation, the predictable comfort of her controlled suffering. Ahead lay mystery, impossibility, and the terrifying prospect of hope. She lifted her face to look at him, really look at him, and saw eternity reflected in his grey eyes. Whatever Thomas was, wherever he'd come from, he was offering her something she'd believed lost forever: the chance to matter to someone, to be precious in the way broken things could still be precious. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Of me?" "Of this." Eleanor gestured helplessly with her free hand, trying to encompass the impossibility of their situation. "Of wanting something I can't understand. Of trusting you when every rational thought tells me." Eleanor Thomas's voice carried such gentle authority that her protests died on her lips. When did rational thought ever help with loneliness? The question pierced her completely. Rational thought had built her prison. Rational thought had convinced her she deserved nothing better than this half-life among the peaks. Rational thought had nearly let her freeze to death in her father's chair, rather than reach for the impossible gift standing at her door. "Teach me," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Whatever you are, whatever this costs me, teach me what I've forgotten." Outside, the storm howled its approval, sealing them together in this space beyond reason, beyond fear, where broken things might yet learn to sing. Thomas's arms tightened around her with infinite tenderness, and Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumble like snow beneath spring sun. But before he could respond to her desperate plea, a sound cut through the storm's howling, the sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the entire cabin. They broke apart as debris rained from the ceiling. Another section of roof had given way, this time over the kitchen, sending pots and preserved goods scattering across the floor in a chaos of metal and glass. "The whole structure's compromised," Thomas said, his voice carrying an urgency that hadn't been there before. "We need to move you somewhere safe." But as Eleanor surveyed the wreckage of her father's kitchen, a terrible realization settled over her. There is nowhere safe. This cabin is all I have. If it falls, then we make sure it doesn't. Thomas moved toward the damaged area with that same unsettling familiarity, examining the sagging beams with the eye of someone who understood construction far better than any drifter should. "Hand me those boards from beside the fireplace." Eleanor stared at him. "You can't possibly think to repair this in the middle of a blizzard. Even if you were—" She stopped, unable to voice what he might or might not be. "Even if I were alive?" Thomas finished quietly, not looking at her. The word hung between them like a blade. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as he finally gave voice to what she'd been struggling not to think. "Thomas!" "Eleanor." He turned to face her, and in the flickering light she could see through him more clearly now, as if her acceptance of the impossible had somehow made him less solid, more translucent. "There are rules to what I can and cannot do. I can hold you, speak with you, even love you, but I cannot change the fundamental nature of things. This storm will pass. This cabin will either stand or fall. And when morning comes, she whispered. But he was already moving again, gathering the tools her father had left behind, working with the desperate efficiency of a man, or the memory of one, who understood that time was running short. Eleanor watched in growing amazement as he braced the sagging kitchen beams, sealed the gaps with whatever materials he could find, moving as if he'd done this same work countless times before. "You know this cabin," she said suddenly. "Not just from tonight. You've been here before." Thomas paused in his work, a hammer frozen in his hand. "Your father was a good man. He helped people in these mountains, never asked questions when miners came to him with injuries they couldn't explain to town doctors. Miners like you? Once." His voice carried the weight of decades. "Long ago." Eleanor felt pieces of a puzzle sliding into place, though the picture they formed defied all logic. The avalanche of 1847. My father used to speak of it, how they never found all the bodies, how some of the miners simply vanished. Thomas set down the hammer with careful precision. 50 years ago, a young man named Thomas McKenna went into those mountains looking for silver. He found something else instead, found a cave-in, a wall of snow and stone that took his life and the lives of 6 other men. He turned to face her, his grey eyes holding depths of sorrow that seemed to span decades. But every 25 years, when the conditions are right, when someone needs saving more than the dead need rest, he finds his way back. The confession should have terrified her. Instead, Eleanor felt an odd sense of completion, as if the final piece of an impossible puzzle had finally found its place. "Why me?" "Because you were dying, Eleanor. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but you were dying by degrees, letting yourself fade away in this cabin like a photograph left too long in sunlight." Thomas moved closer, his form seeming to solidify with the intensity of his words. "Because when I found you, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that broken things can still choose to fight for beauty." Outside, the wind began to shift, its howling taking on a different quality. Eleanor recognized the sound. The storm was starting to weaken, which should have brought relief. Instead, she felt panic rising in her chest. "How long do you have?" she asked. "Until sunrise." Eleanor's breath caught. Through the gaps in the clouds, she could see the faintest suggestion of gray on the eastern horizon. Dawn was still hours away, but not many, not nearly enough. "Then teach me quickly," she said, moving toward him with a determination that surprised them both. "Whatever you came to show me, whatever love feels like, I don't want to waste another moment being afraid." Thomas smiled, and for an instant he seemed completely solid, completely alive, completely hers. "Then come here," he whispered, "and let me show you how precious you are." Eleanor moved toward Thomas with trembling steps, each one a conscious choice to abandon the safety of disbelief. The damaged cabin groaned around them, timbers settling into new configurations, but she barely heard it. All her attention focused on the man, or memory of a man, who waited for her with arms outstretched. When she reached him, Thomas cupped her face with hands that felt impossibly warm for someone who cast no shadow. "Close your eyes," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with such reverence it made her breath catch. "Feel this moment. Make it real." Eleanor obeyed, letting her eyelids flutter shut. In the darkness behind them, she became aware of everything. The whisper of Thomas's breath against her forehead, the solid warmth of his chest so close to hers, the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, suddenly remembering flight. "I've forgotten how to be touched without flinching," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "After the accident, every hand that came near me brought pain. The doctors, always poking and prodding, trying to restore what couldn't be restored. I learned to shrink away from human contact until you convinced yourself you didn't need it," Thomas finished gently. "Until you decided it was easier to be untouchable than untouched." His words struck her with the force of revelation. Yes, that was exactly what she'd done. Somewhere in the long months of recovery, she'd built walls so high and strong that she'd forgotten they were meant to keep pain out, not keep her trapped within. "Show me how to tear them down," she whispered. Thomas's response came not in words, but in action. His lips brushed her forehead, soft as snowfall, then traced a path to her temple. Eleanor tensed instinctively, waiting for the familiar anxiety that accompanied human touch, but it never came. Instead, warmth bloomed beneath his kiss, spreading through her like honey through tea. "Your turn," he murmured against her skin. "Touch me back." Eleanor's eyes flew open. "I can't. My hands, they're ruined, ugly. You shouldn't have to." Eleanor Thomas captured her gnarled fingers in his, lifting them between them. In the firelight, her scars looked less like disfigurement and more like evidence of survival. These hands made music. They brought beauty into the world. They're not ruined. They're transformed. Before she could protest, he guided her palm to his chest, pressing it flat against the place where his heart should beat. Eleanor gasped at the contact, not because of pain, but because of its absence. For the first time in 3 years, her damaged nerves sang with pleasure instead of agony. "How is this possible?" she breathed. "Because," Thomas said, covering her hand with his, "I see you as you truly are. Not broken, not diminished, just changed into something different but no less worthy of love." The word hung between them like a bridge spanning impossible distances. Love. Eleanor had convinced herself she'd forfeited any claim to it when her body betrayed her, when her music died with her mangled fingers. But here stood Thomas, looking at her with such tenderness that she felt beautiful for the first time in years. Outside, the storm's fury continued to diminish, and with each lessening gust of wind, Eleanor felt time slipping away like sand through broken fingers. The approaching dawn meant more than just the end of night. It meant the end of whatever miracle had brought Thomas to her door. "I'm not ready," she said suddenly, urgency creeping into her voice. "For you to leave, I mean. I've just remembered what it feels like to be seen, to matter. How do I go back to the emptiness after this?" Thomas's expression grew infinitely gentle, infinitely sad. "You don't go back, Eleanor. That's the point. I'm not here to give you a taste of something impossible and then leave you hungry. I'm here to remind you that connection, real connection, is always possible. Even after I'm gone, but who could ever understand? Who could look at me and see what you see? Anyone with eyes to recognize strength when they encounter it." Thomas lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "But first you have to believe it yourself. You have to stop seeing damaged goods when you look in the mirror and start seeing a woman who survived the unsurvivable." Eleanor felt tears threatening, but they weren't the bitter tears of self-pity she'd grown accustomed to. These were different, cleansing, transformative. The tears of someone learning to hope again. "Kiss me," she whispered, the words tumbling out before courage could abandon her. "Before dawn comes, Before you have to go, kiss me like I'm worth kissing." Thomas smiled, and in that expression, Eleanor saw all the tenderness the world had forgotten to show her. "Eleanor Whitmore," he murmured, drawing her closer. "You are worth everything." As his lips met hers, Eleanor understood that she was approaching something far more challenging than surviving alone in these mountains. She was approaching the terrifying prospect of believing herself worthy of love, and that would require more courage than she'd ever imagined possible. The kiss changed everything. Thomas's lips moved against hers with a reverence that undid 3 years of careful numbness, and Eleanor felt herself fracturing, not breaking, but opening, like ice cracking under spring warmth. This wasn't the tentative brush of affection she'd imagined in her girlhood fantasies, but something deeper, more transformative, a claiming and a surrendering all at once. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor's legs gave way entirely. Thomas caught her, lowering them both to the rough wooden floor before the dying fire, and she found herself cradled against his chest, listening to a heartbeat that shouldn't exist. "I can't," she whispered, panic suddenly flooding her voice. "Thomas, I can't do this." His arms tightened around her. "Can't do what?" "Believe." The word came out broken, desperate. "I can't let myself believe that I deserve this, that someone could want me as I am now. It hurts too much to hope." And there it was, her greatest fear laid bare between them. Not the physical intimacy, not even Thomas's impossible nature, but the terrifying prospect of allowing herself to matter again. For 3 years, she'd survived by making herself small, by expecting nothing, by accepting that her life was over in every way that counted. The alternative, believing she might still be worthy of love, required a courage that felt impossibly vast. Thomas shifted beneath her, his hand stroking her hair with infinite patience. "Tell me about the accident," he said quietly. Eleanor stiffened. "You don't want to hear—" "I want to hear everything. Every detail you've never spoken aloud." The request should have felt invasive, but something in his voice, gentle, unafraid, made the words come easier than they ever had before. "It was raining," she began, her voice barely audible above the settling timbers. "I was coming back from a performance in Denver, riding with the Ashfords in their new carriage. Mrs. Ashford was so proud of the matched greys, kept talking about how spirited they were." Eleanor's damaged fingers curled against Thomas's chest, too spirited as it turned out. "When the wheel hit that rut, when the carriage overturned, I wasn't afraid at first, even when I felt the bones snapping, when I saw my hands." She stopped, the familiar taste of copper flooding her mouth. "Go on," Thomas urged softly. "I thought it was temporary. Pain always passes, doesn't it? Broken things heal." But weeks went by, then months, and instead of getting better, everything got worse. The infection, the way my legs withered from lying in bed so long. The doctors kept promising recovery was just around the corner, but I could see it in their eyes. They were watching me die by degrees. Eleanor lifted her head to meet Thomas's gaze. "The worst part wasn't losing my music, though that nearly killed me. It was watching people learn to look through me. Friends who used to seek out my company suddenly found excuses to stay away. The few who did visit spoke to me like I was made of glass, or worse, like I was already a ghost. Is that when you came to the mountains? Father left me this cabin in his will. Everyone assumed it was an act of kindness, giving me a place to recover away from the city's prying eyes." Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "But I knew better. Even he couldn't bear to look at what I'd become. The cabin was a kindness, but it was also a banishment." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hand never stopping its gentle movement through her hair. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to span decades. "I died cursing myself for weakness," he said. "The avalanche, I saw it coming, had maybe 30 seconds to run, but there was a boy trapped under some fallen timber. Couldn't have been more than 16. I could have saved myself, Eleanor. Could have lived a full life, married, had children, grown old. Instead, I chose to pull that boy free, and the snow took us both anyway." Eleanor raised her head, studying his face in the firelight. "Do you regret it?" "I did. For 25 years I raged against the unfairness of it all. When I first returned, when I found that boy's mother and saw how she'd built a life around her grief, I was furious. What was the point of my sacrifice if it only created more pain?" "What changed?" Thomas smiled, but it was tinged with sorrow. "I learned that choosing love, even when it costs everything, transforms the chooser more than the chosen. That boy I saved, he lived 3 more minutes. But in those minutes, I became someone capable of putting another's life before my own. And that version of myself, the one born in those final moments, he was worth preserving." Eleanor felt understanding dawn like sunrise. "You're saying my accident?" "I'm saying your suffering revealed something that was always there but never tested. The woman who survived what you've survived, who found reasons to keep breathing even when hope seemed impossible. She's magnificent, Eleanor, and she's worth believing in." Outside, the storm's voice grew quieter, and Eleanor felt the weight of approaching dawn like a physical presence. Soon Thomas would fade back into whatever realm held him between his visits to the living world. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between heartbeats. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Whitmore was ready to find out who she might become. Eleanor's newfound courage lasted exactly until dawn. She woke alone on the cabin floor, wrapped in a quilt she didn't remember taking from her bed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and pale morning light filtered through gaps in the storm shutters, revealing a truth that struck her like a physical blow. There was no sign Thomas had ever existed. The kitchen beams she'd watched him repair hung at their original dangerous angles, still threatening collapse. The tools remained scattered exactly where her father had left them, untouched by ghostly hands. Even the second cup she distinctly remembered filling with coffee sat clean and empty on the shelf, as if it had never been used. Eleanor pulled herself upright, her withered legs protesting the movement, and stared at the space where Thomas had held her through the night. The floorboards showed only her own impression, no evidence that another body had shared her makeshift bed before the fire. "No," she whispered, running her damaged fingers over the wood as if she could conjure proof of his presence. "No, he was here. He kissed me. He told me—" But the cabin offered no confirmation, only the settling silence of a structure that had weathered another storm alone, sheltering only one broken woman who'd apparently spent the night talking to shadows born of isolation and desperation. Eleanor dragged herself to the mirror hanging beside the kitchen window, the same mirror where she'd noticed Thomas cast no reflection. She stared at her face in the silvered glass, searching for some trace of transformation, some evidence that she'd been touched by tenderness. Instead, she saw exactly what had looked back at her for 3 years: hollow cheeks, lifeless eyes, the face of someone who'd forgotten how to hope. The woman who'd believed herself worthy of love just hours before seemed like a stranger now, a character from a dream already fading in daylight's harsh honesty. "How could you be so foolish?" she asked her reflection. The Eleanor in the mirror stared back with familiar contempt. "Did you really think a mountain man would appear in the middle of a blizzard just to convince you that you matter? Did you think someone, anyone, could look at you and see beauty instead of ruin?" The cruelest part was how completely she'd believed it. Not just Thomas's presence, but his words, his touch, the impossible feeling of being cherished exactly as she was. For those brief hours, she'd allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, had dared to think she might still be capable of connection, of growth, of joy. Now, faced with the undeniable evidence of her solitude, Eleanor felt something far worse than her usual despair settling over her. This was the sharp agony of hope withdrawn, of having glimpsed possibility only to have it revealed as delusion. She stumbled to the kitchen window and peered through the gaps in the shutters. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow, pristine, silent, and utterly empty. No footprints marked a path to her door. No evidence suggested anyone had approached the cabin in days. The final proof came when she opened her father's old journal, the one she'd been reading before exhaustion claimed her. There, in her own handwriting from the night before, was a rambling entry about the approaching storm, her fears about the damaged roof, her certainty that she would die alone and unmourned in these mountains. The pages held no mention of a visitor, no record of the conversations that had felt more real than her own heartbeat. Eleanor sank into her father's chair, the journal falling from nerveless fingers. The truth settled over her like a burial shroud. She'd spent the night in conversation with her own fractured mind, projecting her desperate need for connection onto phantoms born of loneliness and approaching madness. The woman who'd believed herself capable of transformation, who'd felt worthy of love for the first time in years, had been nothing more than a fever dream, a beautiful lie her breaking psyche had crafted to make isolation bearable. Outside, the sun climbed higher, its light revealing the full extent of the storm's damage. Trees lay fallen across the path to town, their massive trunks forming barriers that would take weeks to clear. Even if she'd possessed the strength to attempt the journey, which she didn't, Eleanor was now completely cut off from the outside world. She was alone. She had always been alone, and the brief shining hours, when she'd believed otherwise, had been nothing more than her mind's final kindness, before succumbing to the madness that claimed hermits who lived too long without human contact. Eleanor closed her eyes and felt the familiar weight of despair settling over her like an old, suffocating blanket. But this time, it carried something new, the bitter knowledge of what hope felt like and how much more it hurt to lose it than never to have possessed it at all. The dark moment had arrived, and Eleanor Whitmore was finally, utterly, irretrievably broken.